There are so many lovely options when it comes to seam finishes that do not include your standard overlocker, serger, or zigzag stitch. Because if you're like me, you want options. So in today's video, I'm going to show you 7 alternative seam finishes that I just think you'll really, really enjoy. My sewing friends, I'm so excited to get into this topic with you today because there is so much fun in the world of seam finishes that goes way beyond those standard ones that we see, just your overlocker or your serger. Yes, they're the same thing, just different terms. Or your zigzag stitch on your straight machine, right? There is so much more, and that is what this video is for. Now, word of warning, if you are looking for tutorials on all of these, this is not that video. This video is to give you an overview so you know what the possibilities are, so you can see all the options and then you can dive deeper and find out which one's for you and then go and look at that particular technique further and investigate that further. Of course, if you don't know, that is what I do at Vintage Sewing School, VSS. I have the shortcut there, all the tutorials, step by step and step are all there. That's why they're all there. But I even have a challenge for you for today, which is later on, and you can even vote, and I might just make a follow-up video on your favorite seam finish. So let's get into it. First of all though, what is a seam finish? Because, you know, maybe you're just starting out and you're not actually sure what this is or what you're supposed to be doing. A seam finish is where we finish the raw edges of the fabric when it's sewn in a garment. So it's finished, we call it finished so that it stops fraying, so it doesn't just fray out and apart, and so it looks good and provides structure to the fabric. But mostly it's for function so that it doesn't fray. So most of you probably already know about your zigzag stitch that you can do on your regular straight machine. So you can just use that one machine that you have and do a zigzag stitch over the edge. And you know, that works fine, but it can look a little unprofessional, bit homemade, bit not as neat as some of these other ones that I'm going to show you. And of course your overlocker or your serger. So this is a separate machine that does the seam finish that you see on about 99% of all the garments that you have in your closet right now have an overlock or serger finish on it. And it is a separate machine, so you know, some of you may have one, be a little bit intimidated by it, don't be. Or of course, are not ready to invest in a whole separate machine yet. So those are your standard ones that pretty much, they go over there. What about some really nice fancy ones or something different? Because maybe you don't have that overlocker or serger. You just want to try something different, and different seam finishes are appropriate for different fabrics that give you a different look, a different result, and a different feel to the garment when it's all finished. So there's all pros and cons for all of these. These are not, you do the one thing on all the fabrics. That is not how seam finishes work. I think one of the first upgrades that we might do from a zigzag is your Overcast Stitch. So this is another stitch function on your standard straight sewing machine that you can choose, and you can have a special foot designed to go with it, and it really just helps you align that raw edge and get it really, really neat. It makes such a difference when you use the foot. And this stitch, if you use a plain woven fabric, for example, medium weight, you're going to get a really lovely result that almost mimics the overlock stitch when you don't have that separate machine. So it's really good as an alternative to the zigzag stitch on nice stable fabrics like wovens that don't slip and slide, like nothing slippery. It's really good for all of those. It probably has the same cons as a zigzag stitch. Is sometimes some fabrics it just doesn't like it, doesn't work very well. You might find yourself eating the fabric sometimes, and it can just look maybe not as professional as sometimes. It's just all, that's of course opinion of whatever you consider to look good or not as good. A good old-fashioned seam finish is a pinking shear edge. This one is that little zigzag look to the edge of the fabric that maybe you've seen on fabric swatches or something like that. Or if you're like me, I have delved into the world of wearing vintage clothing, you would definitely be much more aware of this finish. It's made using special scissors that have the little zigzag, the pinking shear. They're called pinking shears, the scissors. They have a little zigzag finish on it, and each one of these little zigzags is a little knife blade, each of one of those. So they are a bit harder to maintain than your regular scissors, but you basically just lay your pattern down and you can cut out your pattern with the pinking shear scissors. That way you save a lot of time because you're actually cutting it out as you cut out your pattern, and your seam finish is all in one. I know, it's pretty handy. So you do need to, if you do that, you do need to be aware that you're adding a little bit of extra because you're probably not cutting your paper. So you need to just really accurately measure. Is your seam finish, where you do your straight stitch, is it to the end of the zigs on this side, or is it like to the inner side? You just need to make sure you measure that so your stitch line remains exactly the same, 100% where it should be. This one is good for if you don't have any options and want something kind of a light duty seam finish, because it is not as heavy duty or robust as the others, it still will fray out a little bit. It works because the little zigzags that you got, only those little triangle parts actually fray, and then it kind of gets to that point and it stops because it can't fray anymore after that. That's how it works. So I would only use this for light duty stuff that you're going to very delicately wash or even hand wash. I do pinking shears in the machine, but very gentle. It is really good use for sheer fabrics. So if you want that light duty seam finish, and you can just pinking shear the edge where it's sheer so you see through it, and it's really nice because you don't have any of these like nest of threads or anything like that impeding your view underneath, is what it's really good for too. Or really thick bulky fabrics like a boiled wool that maybe doesn't fray, but you just want that neat kind of edge to it. Pinking shear is a really great option. The French seam. I know you've heard of this one and are wondering, what on earth is this? I don't think it is French. Actually, someone once said that they were French, and they said, this is really funny because in France, we call it an English seam. I found that really funny. So we call it a French seam. This one is created by first sewing your wrong sides together, and then you trim down the seam allowance so it's really small. You press it and then you turn it back out to do right sides together and then stitch it. And you're enclosing all of those raw edges inside that seam. Yes, it is a little bit more complicated, but yes, it does look really amazing. This is really good for, again, sheer fabrics where you have that see-through factor, so because you don't see any of this messy stitching or overlock threads, anything like that. So it's really nice for that sort of thing. Can be really good for anything you've got, like see the inside. If you say a coat or a jacket, you open it up where you might see those seams inside, have that French seam because there's nothing like visible there. It just kind of blends in and looks really great. It's really good for fine fabrics, you know, think lingerie, anything like slippery, slinky, and very fine fabrics. It works really well for too. It's not so good for bulky fabrics. By the time you like fold this over and over, they end up really thick and chunky. So it's not good for those often. And it's not good for things that you, well, either need to fit as you go because you can't, because you have to sew it wrong sides together first. You can't sort of put it on and then like pin and say, oh, I'll just fit it here or there, or get a look at you. It needs to fit. No, you need to know that it fits you 100% accurately. First up, straight out of the bat, because once you sew it, it's really hard to undo, and then you can't really make adjustments once it's done. So it's kind of a, you just do it and it needs to fit as it is. And it's also not really good for curved seams. Well, by curved seams, I mean, for example, underarm seams, like your armholes. Generally, it's just too curvy, it's too difficult. You can do it, but it's like level up here. Most cases, what you'll want to do is maybe a combination. Maybe you use French seams for all of the vertical seams coming down, but for example, you'll see it on clothing a lot. The armhole seams might have a bound seam or a Hong Kong binding. We'll talk about that in a minute. A really great option is a felled seam. So we'll first talk about the machine felled. So you can either do machine or hand felled. This one works similar to a French seam, but in my opinion, a little bit easier to navigate. You sew right sides together, and then what you do is you trim down one side of that seam allowance. So just one side, trim that down. And then the long one that's left, you actually fold it over itself, and then you stitch that down to the garment. So you see this seam all the time. Think jeans, men's shirts. You've seen it, right? You know where it's kind of just folded over and it's stitched on top. That is a felled seam, a machine felled seam. The alternative is a hand felled seam. So it works the exact same method, but instead of machining it down, you hand sew it so you get an invisible finish. I really enjoy this seam finish because it's just as neat and tidy, if not even more, than a French seam, but it holds it in place so it's all contained. There's nothing flapping around, and you can fit as you go and make adjustments to it. Because it starts out being sewn right sides together and you sew it on the stitch line, it's a lot easier to navigate during fitting, during like making alterations and changes, and just being able to sew with it in general is a lot more forgiving. So that's why I really like it. The bound seam, or a Hong Kong binding, you also might hear it being called. This is where your seam finish, your raw edges, are actually bound in a bias binding. Usually bias because a bias binding, as opposed to a straight ribbon, a ribbon doesn't curve at all, it's just straight. So we use a bias tape because it will manage curves and be easier to go around all sorts of things. So it is actually bound and the raw edges are bound. So it can be open or closed. Any of these can be used, well, besides French and felled seams, can be either open or closed. So this is a really, really nice finish for all sorts of applications. You can use it for finer fabrics and sheer fabrics, again, because you see through and then you just see the binding, which is sometimes quite nice. It also works for thick fabrics where you want to bind those edges with a finer fabric. So say you've got a thick wool coat, but you can use a really light bias binding to bind those edges so that it's not as thick and bulky, right? It's nice and fine. And it's really good for where you want to see them, where they're visible. Say for inside that coat again, if you open it up and you've got the bound seams on the inside, it's really nice to have, say, a contrast color or make it a feature, right? Again, the only downside is if you do it closed, it's harder to make alterations later. You have to sort of undo that whole seam finish to use it. It can get a little bit thick and chunky, so because you're adding more fabric to those seams, it can get thick and chunky, so it's always dependent on the fabric that you're using and where it is on the garment. And it can add a bit of stiffness and structure to the garment. This could be good or it could be bad, so depending on what you want. Because you're sort of stitching more rows of stitching and more fabric, and it just kind of holds it tight. So say a really soft, floaty, flowy skirt in like a soft, floaty fabric, right? A rayon or viscose, something like that. You probably wouldn't want to bind the seams because it will just be adding too much bulk and sort of stiffness to the seams because you want it soft and relaxed. So you would choose a different seam finish for that application, for example. The turn and stitch seam finish is one that I see a lot, not used so much anymore because I think we've got better machines, much more options available to us. But this one was more a vintage kind of technique where it is simply, the edges are simply turned over and stitched down. Because when you turn over the raw edge underneath, it's not going to fray anywhere near as much, like cutting it down by 90% if you actually put it between fabric. So it's kind of covered right in between. And then you put a stitch across it. It also helps hold in all those raw edges and makes it obviously neat and tidy from the finish. And looks great. The only problem is that, again, it's probably a lighter duty one because you still do have those raw edges there, and you'll find that you might get some strands poking out every now and again. And you can run into trouble, just like the pinking shear, when you cut it out. You need to allow a little bit more seam allowance so that you can actually turn it over and stitch it, because if you just have your regular 5/8, you find that it's just too small to be turning and stitching. So you do need to add a little bit and just be really careful of where your stitch line is. It's a really great alternative for most things. It just depends on what you're doing and what you've got in front of you. Really good for things like straight seams where it's just on grain and it's straight, you just turn it over and stitch, is a really good option. All of these are really dependent on the fabric, where it is on the garment. So the type of seam, is it straight, is it curved? There are many different things that you just need to consider when you're choosing your seam finish, but this gives you a great list to start from. So I have a challenge for you, and that is to try one on your next garment, on your next make. Which one of these are you going to try? Stretch those skills and try something new. This is the easiest way to take your sewing to the next level, is to try a new seam finish to really make those insides zing. Which are you going to choose? Which do you want to see the tutorial of? Leave your vote below and I'll just make a follow-up video for you on it. Until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.